Hi everyone, thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Manijay Verghese, I'm the head of the AA's public program, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's lecture, Radical Democracy in Architecture, Politics, Positions, Planning by Gabu Heindl. I think I have waited a lifetime for someone to show a clip of Zoolander in this room. I never realized that was my ambition until just now, but I think that is one of my favorite clips ever, so I didn't even know that was going to happen, so I think that's a pretty exciting sneak preview. So this talk is part of our ongoing series, New Canonical Histories, where we've invited architects, artists, and theorists who are rewriting the architectural canon or retelling history from a new perspective. And they're doing this to give us tools to not only reimagine our past, but also to reimagine our future. Tonight's speaker has been doing exactly that through her work within architecture and urban planning, as well as through her theoretical research. Tonight, she'll speak to us about how to tackle the challenges of the post-democratic city, a condition produced by neoliberalism and nationalist authoritarian policies working together to co-produce post-democratic public spheres. And it's a condition that she's tackling through a radical democratic conception of architecture and urbanism. So Gabu Heindl unfolds these topics with regard to A, their current anti-capitalist struggles over housing and public space in Vienna, B, their work on intersectionality in housing, and C, a magistrate-commissioned non-building plan which became politically articulated in an alliance with a bottom-up urban movement. To tell you a little bit more about Gabu before I hand over to her, she's based in Vienna where she teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts, but she's also a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield, and the work of her practice addresses public space, buildings, collective housing, urban planning, and urban research. While she's currently based in Vienna, she has traveled the world and studied in Princeton, the Academy of Fine Arts at Vienna, and also Tokyo Geisha University. And from 2013 to 2017, she was chairwoman of the Austrian Society for Architecture, and she's also the author of numerous publications and curators of exhibitions and symposia. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Gabu to the AA.
Thank you very much, Manijay, for this beautiful introduction, and thanks to AA for having me here. And thank you all for being here, and I hope you can spend an hour with me and then hopefully more of a discussion. I will come back to the clip Zoolander that we just saw later on, and I'm sure it will stick with you throughout my lecture. Radical democracy in architecture. I want to just briefly introduce myself as what I would call a rather normal architect, or I really want to say that in order to make clear that what I'm going to say from now on is based on 10 to 15 years of practice. I have an architectural office in Vienna. We are doing, and you see here just a couple of things. Actually, what we concentrated on from the beginning was to work on public commissions, public space, public buildings, urban design, exhibition design, anything that actually is not necessarily kind of a private interest. However, we do consider housing to be a public interest. So housing also is within our interest and our portfolio. And what I won't show today at all, but it is a bit kind of related to what I will show, what we'll talk about, is that we are also working several times, have been working on politics of history, actually on the history of remembrance, especially on National Socialist history in public space. This is a whole other field of work that I cannot show today, but it relates, of course, to the question of a post-democratic crisis. So why would an architect be interested in radical democracy? I do think, and it's not only me, of course, we are facing a couple of crises of democracy, and for sure two of them. One being what we could call the post-political neoliberal crisis, or what theorists have called post-democracy, which is based on consensus, which is based on so-called, there is an alternative, TINA conditions. But we are also, and that's maybe kind of newer, also facing a crisis of democracy in terms of right-wing authoritarian politics. And I'm coming from Austria, I may absolutely say that, and you decide for your place how far that is a crisis. But we're also facing a crisis of planning, and also to my students, the question really, how can we actually plan in a post-political city when what is proposed to us seems like consensual technocracy? How do we actually plan within the new governance of austerity when the state should become slim, when shared city and smart city actually become slogans for ever-reducing square meters for those who cannot afford it? And, which is really something that I've been dealing and discussing and debating about recently a lot, when we're facing negotiation urbanism, which basically means there's planning deals between private large-scale investors and the public cooperative planning processes, PPP, public-private partnerships, I'm sure that says something to you, building improvement districts, something that Austrians don't believe that, or Viennese don't think they have in Vienna, that they only project it onto London, which of course is not true at all, and or also privately owned public space POPs. So what I will wrap all of this into is the abbreviation of PPP. So PPP stands for me for this sort of negotiation urbanism. So what that has a result actually is a large scale or an ever-growing commodification of urban space, of public goods, privatization of housing, and this gets us right into the central topic. Actually, housing is, I would say, the biggest crisis at the moment, European-wide, partly worldwide. I'm invited into several places, or have been invited to actually talk about what I will show you now, because I come from Vienna, and Vienna is supposedly heaven of housing. So, within this context, what I did the last couple of years was write a book which is hopefully soon coming out, and it's called The Other PPP. It's a reaction to what we could kind of frame as short, kind of in the short PPP, public-private partnerships, to say, okay, let's caper that and let's win back a notion of public, let's win back a notion of politics, planning, and popular agency as another PPP. And I will get you through these three Ps, if you may so. Politics. Politics, I'm not going to speak so much about the political, but political theory by writing about the political has actually made it, I would say, easier again in architecture also to think the political, think it not so much at once in party politics, but actually think it in terms of based on conflict, in terms of based on the notion, in fact, of how to tackle issues that so much relate to architecture and urban planning. For that, I want to give you an image of this praised Vienna. This is in the center of Vienna, first district, and it says here, you don't have to live in these apartments to love Vienna, owning them will do. It doesn't even say owing them, it says owning them will do. So this is not ad busting and nothing, and I didn't make this up. This is one of these posters of many such posters that you can find again worldwide, especially in the city centers. This is where David Harvey would say it's basically putting excess money, especially from the financial crisis, into the city centers, placing them and using apartments as commodities and not really as apartments in terms of the need of housing. So when I start with politics and we're looking at facades, it may sound weird, but actually I'm going to show you a second inscription, facade inscription, that we can find in Vienna many more times, and it actually always says something similar. It says, and I'll translate it to you in big red letters, this building is built by the Commune of Vienna, by the city of Vienna, in the years so and so, in this case it's 1925 to 26, by the means of the housing tax. And the housing tax, Wohnbausteuer, is sometimes even written in larger fonts. So basically, imagine that you walk through Vienna and on 400 buildings, you'd have these letters. They're very abstract. It's one of these inscriptions that you don't see anymore, yeah? Because it's like you became so used to it. And however, if you really look at it carefully, there was a time, and this is the time I will speak briefly about to get you into kind of a canonical history or rewriting of histories. It's the time of Red Vienna, when basically from 1919 to 1934, a social democratic government of Vienna developed 400 of these buildings, always ever again writing in big red letters proudly that it was actually financed by a special tax. Can you imagine any government today to write a tax proudly onto a facade? Surely not. And that is exactly what actually my project in brief is about. I do believe that as architects and urbanists, we need to inherit lost futures of the past, of history. Yeah? And there I'm basically building my theory on Jacques Derrida's idea of inheritance is always the reaffirmation of a debt, but a critical, selective, and filtering reaffirmation. Yeah? If we look back at such a time, for instance, as Red Vienna, then we will not inherit it one-to-one, and I will show you why. Or maybe somebody much closer to you, Mark Fisher, who wrote about lost futures and critiquing or saying there was lost futures in the past that would get us beyond whiteness and paternalism, for instance, of the welfare state. But it is the welfare state itself is a lost future. So the interesting, what we could gain from it is a renewed concept of the public, maybe a more powerful one, and also, as I'm interested in rebel cities, sanctuary cities, new municipalities, Red Vienna specifically, of course, gives us an alliance, a historic alliance to such cities today. So what's Red Vienna? Red Vienna, I already mentioned the time, the period. It was a time of redistribution and a large-scale communal building program. It was based on Austro-Marxist politics of hegemony. We could learn an idea of a public or of the institution. This is where Chantal Mouffe, who is of course also familiar to you, who is claiming to say, okay, if we want to radicalize democracy, we have to do it within and outside of institutions. And I would propose Red Vienna to be an interesting institution to study. And Red Vienna, as a big house, like as a housing program, actually teaches us politics without purism. It's actually less pure than, for instance, the Neue Frankfurt. It's not radicalist in its politics, and it's not aestheticist. And you can see here, if you think of this as mass housing of the 1920s, then Red Vienna looks much different to mass housing of das Neue Bauen, of the new building time of Frankfurt in the 1920s, for instance. And I want to add somebody else, and this is actually Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, who was one of the first architects, female architects in Vienna. She became 102 years old. Imagine that. And she taught me something. I actually knew her personally. I had the luck to actually meet her and have spent quite some years as her neighbor and sub-renter with her. And as an architect of Red Vienna and New Frankfurt, she was critical of Red Vienna. She was supporting the alternative within what we would call the alternative Red Vienna settlers movement. I will come back to that. But she was also fighting throughout her life for women's rights, for minorities' rights, and she was fighting, and that, so to say, got her even, sadly, most famous. She was a clear anti-fascist resistance fighter against National Socialism, and they nearly got her killed and so on. So I would say she taught me that as an architect, you can actually not separate, split yourself in terms of saying, okay, well, politically we should do that, but architecturally I have to do that. Yeah? What she was clearly stating was, okay, well, anybody has to take a position, be it politically and architecturally together, and maybe you know people who actually claim that, that you could split such sides. Okay, I want to run you slowly through the preconditions of Red Vienna to show that it's actually something that could be even today. In the precondition of Red Vienna, there was a huge housing crisis. We could say that's something that we face in cities today just as well. But, and that's different to many places, there was and the government then actually continued that. They already inherited strong rent control and a good protection of tenants. What does that mean? If you have if you have rent control, rents limited, actually turned out that there was no interest in private, or let's say, no private investment in housing. Private investors didn't want to build housing because you couldn't make profit from it. That, of course, increased the housing shortage, which was a problem, and it decreased the land prices. Now, if you had such a situation today that you have a housing crisis and the private industry doesn't want to build, what would the government do? What would politicians do? They would say we have to put out incentives, we have to help the private markets to build. Some would do. Red Vienna actually said no, we will do it ourselves. Yeah? We will actually actively purchase land. We will invent taxes, yeah? Like I already mentioned, the Vienna's housing tax, a luxury tax that was literally taxing luxury goods, luxury any luxury activities for redistribution. They were improving social and health services, invested in culture and recreation, because they also follow this a concept of hegemony, that you basically, with culture, with social interaction, that you get the population to actually support you in your big-scale political program. And, of course, the most, so to say, the thing that stayed the most, that is still with us in Vienna until today, is the 64,000 apartments that they built in these years. And 34, it was destroyed because of an Austro-fascist moment, also for Austro-fascism ruling, and then 4 years later, it was National Socialism that, of course, had a completely other housing policy. So, how did it look like? Vienna had tax sovereignty, but tax sovereignty by itself doesn't do redistribution. So you can see here a very famous poster of for the so-called housing, the luxury tax. Yeah, so you see the red hand kind of taking the champagne bottle, and of course, I'm not saying, and this is exactly what I mean by critically inheriting. We cannot redo or redraw something like this anymore. Or we can certainly not, I would say, see the red big man saying, okay, well, I promised you so much housing and I will ever build more. So this is exactly a kind of historic paternalist condition that we need to absolutely critique. On the other hand, and this is the filtering process that Derrida speaks about, to see what is interesting in it for our current times plus future. And there was a lot of information also for the population. For instance, as the third poster shows, to actually inform the extremely progressive housing tax that would actually take a lot of money, tax rich people a lot, and poor people very, very low. So, famous Otto Neurath drew, made drawings, of course, to show how ever more housing was built in his time. Then siting of housing became a real political statement. What you see here is a plan of 1932, where all the black dots are actually showing these different communal houses. So there wasn't, except for in this time, the first district, the very central district, there wasn't a district where social communal housing wasn't placed. It was even important that it would be placed in all the bourgeois districts just as much as in the workers' districts. You could call that even an antagonistic statement. Yeah? This is the very famous Karl Marx Hof. So it was not only placed specifically in the 19th district, which is a bourgeois district. It's enormously big. Yeah? And it is, as you can see, aesthetically, it even presents itself like a castle or some sort of really defending architecture. That was critiqued, for instance, by Manfredo Tafuri and so on. Manfredo Tafuri wrote a book, Vienna Rossa, where he was very interested and torn with the aesthetics and the politics of Red Vienna. But as kind of strong architectural form in the city, and I think even Vittorio Arelli also mentioned it sometimes, you could actually read it as an antagonistic statement, and it was, of course, very much disliked by the political opponent. Red Vienna was also reacting to the existing city. For instance, this is a little poster claiming that along the so-called Gürtel, with a fill-in of houses, they would build the Ringstraße des Proletariats, which means that the Ringstraße, being the bourgeois, beautiful boulevard in the first center, to actually build a similar boulevard for the proletarians, just kind of a ring further. Or, as Yves Blau beautifully works out in her book Red Vienna, there's large-scale structures that are really open in the city, and they're basically like Rabenhof, cities within the city, but they are not at all kind of these closed structures, but actually open up courtyards. And if you walk there today, it's beautiful gardens that are open to the public. So Red Vienna was more than just housing. It had also libraries, schools, kindergartens, swimming pools, etc. Giving you a really, really fast wrap-up. Vienna today, and this is of course interesting because not only did until 34 was 64,000 apartments built, but today 420,000 apartments in Vienna are either council or subsidized housing. That means that like we have 2 million population in the city. Of that, 60% of the Viennese live in municipal or subsidized housing, in that what you would call social housing. And 75% of the Viennese rent. And renting is, of course, the total opposite strategy to a right to buy, or something that's based on Margaret Thatcher's idea of like housing, privatizing housing is opposing. In the 70s, for instance, these famous Alt-Erler buildings were built. They have kind of a career at the moment. What you don't see here on all of these buildings, there are swimming pools on the roof. So this idea of having swimming pools on roofs of affordable housing is something that you can actually really learn from Vienna's social housing or Vienna's housing policy. Vienna is also a city, and now I sound like the advertising person of Vienna. It will change in a moment. But why I'm doing this is because I believe it's important to see the good and kind of the critical sides. Yeah? So Vienna, because Vienna is growing just as any other city and quite fast, is using several inner city but also further out areas to actually develop further. And this is one large-scale city development called Seestadt Aspern, or Aspern Urban Lakeside. You see this master plan for 20,000 residents. And what Vienna did is, and I think it's quite unusual, it built the subway there before one single building was built. So you'd have the subway run throughout the city to this development, you see here into the green field, and then the houses started to be built. So I'm just saying this is a heritage of Red Vienna in terms of understanding that public transportation, that public housing, that social housing and so on is in fact of public interest and a public task. So what you rent or what you pay in social housing at the moment is around $750 and less, or more, it's an average. But unfortunately on the private market, you pay the double. So what I'm saying in Vienna at the moment, a lot of people actually are lucky within the system, and a lot of people are very unlucky that are outside the system. And because of the rapid growth and so on, so social housing is going down and private housing is actually increasing in relationship. So that is actually really creating a housing or a crisis in Vienna just as much. So we cannot just say everything is great, but we must also critically inherit. That means reactivate lost futures, but critique paternalism, critique what I will show you, what is embedded in Vienna. What is astonishing until today of this time is, can you imagine that in Red Vienna, rent was around 4% of the income of people? How much do you pay? Do you pay? It's incredible. Yeah? Actually, this number is so low that historians have been fighting to say it was politically stupid, because to be so low made actually Red Vienna be dependent on rich people to continuously be able to be taxed. Because if you don't have these taxes, to actually get money to continue to build this very low price renting. So that doesn't mean that it has to be very high, but the question is if it's sustainable. But it did cover only maintenance and operating costs, and it is at the moment an enormous driving force for people to say, actually, this is utopian, yeah? Utopian in the past to say what could actually be possible. What is bothering until today is that already then there was an allocation system that was basically Viennese first. Yeah? So you'd have a kind of points a point system of classifying applicants for the dwellings, and these actually put people that were already living in Vienna, that had residency and so on first. And that is something that we, like critical architects like me in Vienna, critique until today, and it has just been actually strengthened. It has just been made even harder for people who are not from Vienna, and especially in this constant discussion about migration, to actually access the system, which is of course at the end of the day highly even racist and not to be supported. And then, you know, it's all this what of course is that goes now for all historic building or historic housing programs. For this time, Red Vienna was also extremely standardized, very small, kind of, it had classical turnkey apartment sizes, and there was a paternalism embedded not only in the images that you just saw, but also did it not allow self-initiative, self-build, self-organization, and there was a certain fetishization of work, which of course is a problem until today, because even today we have to ask ourselves, I mean, there is no such thing as the proletarians anymore, as this large body of people, but to ask ourselves, what's the relationship, what is this new precarious people that would be the subject of today's housing policies. However, in Red Vienna there was alternatives in the alternatives, as for instance a settlers movement, because housing was so extreme, housing crisis was so extreme that people started to squat land and actually build themselves. And it was a lot of women, also building, and families just being there anarchistically doing that, which then Red Vienna kind of in its paternalistic mode managed to get within the system, organized, however, like collectively, institutionally organized self-building. By, for instance, here you could put in hours of your work rather than money, but what is important is you couldn't build your own house, but you had to build somebody else's house. It's important to have these little details to say, okay, how do you actually build collectivity? This is the time when Adolf Loos invented his house with one wall, you know, like basically saying, okay, you can stack buildings together and have just one wall. And, for instance, one alternative within this moment was the so-called house with one kitchen, which was a result of a feminist movement, saying, okay, within this entire house, you'd have a central kitchen where you'd cook, or somebody would cook for the different families in order for the women not to have to cook. So, and this was the historic part of the lecture. And it gets us to a work that we're currently doing, which is a commission by the Workers' Chamber of Vienna to actually study concepts of justice in urban planning, in housing, public space, and participation. And what we're doing is we're looking back, so to say 100 years, into this Red Vienna. We're projecting from today and from the past into the future, and actually creating a future concept, like a utopia of how a juster city planning could be named, in order to kind of look back and say what would be the steps to get there. And believe me, of course, this is very difficult. As Mark Fisher already said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Well, but the idea is, and the commission is, and I think many of such studies should be commissioned to say, okay, let's really imagine how it should be, because we very often know how it should not be. And this is why, for instance, like for a publication, I wrote a little manifesto. And I think we also need to write many more manifestos in order to really say, okay, we need to write it down and take it out there. So this is just briefly a so-called CARE manifesto: claim public property as public, and turn public housing into democratic duty. Acquire urban land as commons and cease selling public ground. Raise the number of communal and cooperative housing and rent to everyone without discrimination. Explain why housing is a public interest and duty, and expropriate the expropriators. And that's, of course, something that is very difficult to say, especially when I give talks in the US. It's even more difficult, but it's not about expropriating in terms of stealing something, but it's expropriating, and I don't know if you heard about 60% of the Berliners being for expropriating large-scale privatized housing companies. So basically to say, okay, the real expropriation takes place by those who actually make money by somebody else's need of housing. So this was the part of politics, and now you're going to ask, okay, yourself, okay, well, she really places out a manifesto. It's extremely brave and very, could be stupid, but I want to actually show you how within our planning situation, like within that what we are doing, planning, and with regard to popular agency, how could we actually deal with such questions? I'm sure you're aware of this beautiful question of Giancarlo De Carlo, who critiqued this time, exactly this time that I'm talking about, Red Vienna, or also das Neue Bauen in Frankfurt, die Wohnung für das Existenzminimum, the apartment for the existential minimum, to say, okay, well, if architects were actually just asking how you would design such an apartment, they really forgot to ask why or what. Yeah? Like, why would you actually design a place in the most creative way and try to make people believe, or try to make people not see that they're forced to live on very small space? So what I was looking into, also other people did, of course, was the history of withdrawal of planning, which got us into also our planning mess. So there was a master plan critique since the 1960s that says, well, top-down master planning is anti-democratic and tabula rasa. I think we all agree. Funny enough, there was of course also critique from the right to say it's not liberal enough. Yeah? It's inefficient master planning. So that actually, and this is now going to be, it's a very short kind of wrap-up, says, okay, comprehensive turns communicative. Yeah? You all know kind of Habermashian concept of let's be kind of all the same eye level on a table and communicate. And that I will show that problem in planning. And of course, planners and architects, and I'm sure you all architecture students are experiencing planning dilemmas. And especially in the 1960s and 1970s, the idea of that all planning works for the powerful, even advocacy planning, for instance, or planning is generally functionalized by advanced capitalism. Architecture is an appeasement strategy for social injustice. Yeah? So it seems that critical planning is impossible. It actually seems that we should go home and stop planning, right? And this is really also what today my students are asking, or we are all kind of course, asking ourselves. And this is the famous hand of Le Corbusier in his La Vie Radieuse. And of course, this is exactly what has been critiqued. Yeah? How can we have this? We cannot be this godlike figure that destroys half of Paris or so in order to have a new city. But what we have today is this is the hand of investor in Vienna on a large piece of area to be developed. And he's part of, and a very powerful part of, a communicative cooperative planning process. And there's a tendency, or something happened, and I would call that instead of advocacy planning, we now have advocates planning. Yeah? We have actually advocates make the rules for big planning decisions in urbanism. There's, just to give you some examples, also in Vienna, we have like there's just been a revived concept for flexible guidelines for high-rise buildings, which basically, I'm not against high-rise buildings, yeah, but the more you flexibilize guidelines, the more easier you make it for very powerful players in participative projects to actually demand their high-rise building, for instance. There's concepts of negotiable urban planning deals. I'm sure that's all, like basically we could say London has played it up for us, yeah, has shown us where it gets to, and sadly enough, Vienna is also heading this direction. So coming back to our planning dilemma, the reactions in the 60s or 70s were, okay, well, either no more planning, well, that would be sad because we're all planners or architects, or we do situationism, we retrieve into disciplinary autonomy, participation, cooperation process. It's all, don't get me wrong, it's all interesting things, interesting ways of actually doing architecture, very important reactions to Le Corbusier's hand. Yeah? However, and here I totally agree with Rem Koolhaas, that it also got us into a situation where lots of cities are being built big scale, and the question is whatever happened to urbanism? Where are the concepts of urbanism? However, where I don't agree with Rem Koolhaas is that that would be the moment to actually define new fundamentals of architecture, being, as you all know, from the Biennale of 2014, being floor, wall, ceiling, roof, etc. Yeah? And he was rightly critiqued, I find, for missing economy, for missing ground politics, and so on. Yeah? So basically, we cannot, again, kind of just say architecture is the disciplinary mode of knowing how to design a floor or a wall. And again, don't get me wrong, I think it's very important to know how to design a wall and a door. And this is why I showed you in the beginning that this is what I do. And certainly I'm absolutely not a fan of the idea of manifestos done by somebody else. You all know that, for instance, all free market. Rather, I'm trying to set up a planning theory, or actually this is what I was writing about, to say planning could be a contingent setting in dispute, saying that planning is not settling a dispute. Yeah? It's not about planning appeasing, but it is a setting in dispute, saying it's a setting that has been struggled over, a position which remains in dispute, yeah? Which is disputable. And that's something that makes it possible, yeah? In times when you say it's actually it would be impossible to plan, we still need to plan. Yeah? That's similar to the post-foundational paradox, which is saying, okay, if there is no given foundations, there's ever more, or it ever more enables and necessitates to do new foundations, to do new foundings. Yeah? That means that basically we must plan, yeah? Ever more, even so we know that we have a critical relationship to it. And in post-foundational theory, with Oliver Machert as a theorist of this of post-foundationalism, he distinguishes between an ethical democracy or an ethical politics, yeah, that would mean that we act uncompromised, yeah, that we have only clean hands, that everybody gets happy. And as you know, something like this doesn't exist. Yeah? We cannot plan that everybody gets happy. So planning is positioning. And what he basically does is like turning around and say what we need is democratic ethics, saying we have to be ready to acknowledge that our hands will get dirty. They don't have to get super dirty. I think, I'm not talking about mafia planning here, or I don't know. It is about getting involved and finding possibilities. Yeah? We are not, and if you do that, we are doing this without losing sight of justice, or be it equality, be it solidarity. Yeah? It's a pragmatic way, but it's not cynical, and that's really important. Yeah? It's pragmatic in terms of minimal politics. What is possible? How much is possible? And that now, having said that, and that was basically already most of the theory, I will show you some examples where I believe that if we think a new public, and if we reconsider our mode of planning, then radical democracy is certainly about popular agency, and popular agency also, or like architecture opening up for popular agency. How do I mean that? Going through that a bit faster because it doesn't need to sound like a formula or a recipe. But I do believe that as architects we do need some unlearning, an unlearning of our privileges. Yeah? I mean, think of everybody here sitting here. Who are we? What are our privileges ourselves? Yeah? We also need to untrain some expertise. I don't know if I'm sure you've yourself found yourself in a situation as have I, to seem to know who you're planning for, or to seem to know and actually not know. But, and I'm not romanticizing here non-identity, because I do think that with relying while we need to untrain expertise, we need to use expertise. Yeah? Expertise in terms of partisan planning, in terms of taking a position. And what I'm most interested in, positions or alliances in new hegemonies. Yeah? Basically, how can we work together with queer and metal workers and. To actually say, okay, it's about setting up intersectional hegemonies. And what I would call presumptuous demands, for instance, okay, what if we demand, knowing that it's impossible, but demand luxury for all? Yeah? And I will just give you exactly an example of where we tried, where, you know, this could be what was one of a measure. So measuring is something I'm really interested in, and we all measure as architects, and this is why I framed this wording vermessen fordern, which is vermessen is a German word that is at the same time presumptuous and miscounting. Yeah? And fordern is the word for demand. Demand here is related to Ernesto Laclau's concept of that you need that within agency, a demand is creating an agency. Yeah? And one of my references, Jacques Rancière, would say, politics arises from a count of community parts, which is always a false count, a double count or a miscount. Yeah? So basically, there is something about productive miscounting. And now I come back to actually Zuländer, for whoever was here just before. When if you remember Zuländer's scene, yeah, Zuländer actually looking at this model in the scale, well, let's guess 1 to 100 or maybe, and he's very furious and says, how can we actually teach children if they don't even fit into this building? Yeah? It's much too small. Then this is the moment where he actually, in this scene, in this moment of the movie, of course, playing up a kind of a joke, but to take that serious is like, okay, he acknowledges or actually disacknowledges the fact that everybody seems to know that this is scaled down. So no. And then with like playing out this joke, I think he still argues for that we do all too easily take for granted that kindergartens are very small, that square meters or budget for schools are very low, and. So basically to really question, as if we were stupid, why this is so small. Yeah? Why is that so small? It doesn't have to be like this. So I wanted to build a roof terrace on a school. Yeah? There's like roof terraces, swimming pools, etc. Within austerity politics in Austria also, that is not so easy. We're talking about a school that is a school for 1,000 kids, and it was built in the 60s, and we did extensions of this part, and with this extension also built 6 different courtyards, could differentiate them nicely. This is 1,000 kids is a possibility. You still have a possibility in splitting up in some groups of interested kids to actually do a participation project. And they developed very interesting ideas, and one of them was, of course, also a roof terrace, which I would have liked to do or done. So I'm not going to show you this project, which has many different parts, but as you can see, we kind of managed to have lots of terraces, balconies, and so on for the kids, open classroom, closed classrooms, and so on. But this roof terrace was really the moment of debate or conflict, one of those. Yeah? We wanted to have this entire terrace, the entire roof to become a terrace. And the client, to give the money, didn't want a roof terrace at all. And his argument was, if we build a roof terrace on this school, every other school wants one also. This is why we will not do it. And this is, of course, where the architect says, well, we have to do it, to make sure that every other school also demands it. Yeah? And so what we actually managed at the end was we did not manage to have the entire roof, a roof terrace, but we managed a smaller version. Yeah? But I could actually include in the budget, and not even in a hidden way, but like outspokenly with the client, I could include metal infrastructure all around the edge of the roof to later on, when there's an extra budget, to extend the roof terrace to the entire size. So what I want to say is sometimes, and this is minimal politics, you cannot achieve everything, yeah? But even if you achieve only a compromise, you can still maybe implement the future of the full achievement. Yeah? You should not give it up. Yeah? So basically just to say, well, let's do this then, but we make sure that later on it's not too much of a hassle to actually enlarge it. With such an idea of what you can do, I want to show you a project which is very, very beautiful, and it's not my invention. Yeah? It's a project that is, we called it Intersectional City House, and its topics are right to housing, reuse of vacancy, it's self-built, do-it-yourself, ecological, supporting the neighborhood, solidarity economy, utopian model of society, lived solidarity. It's critiquing racism, ableism, discrimination, sharing economy, using, not owning, and it's a co-housing as one kitchen house. Sounds like great, and it's, as I said, that's something an architect cannot invent. You have to actually have a strong group of people who have such a vision. And this was like a group of 20 people who found a house in the 16th district in Vienna, which is a very migrant district, very conflictuous district, and this is the house. And they were actually able to rent the house as a whole. And what we did is we turned this house with minimum budget into one kitchen house. Into one kitchen house that works in section. So you basically have a large kitchen for everybody in the ground floor. And on the upper floors, you only have private rooms, smaller and larger. There's people who are in the wheelchair. There's, the group itself is kind of working together with Queerbase, who is supporting refugees who are leaving and had to flee because of their sexual orientations. There's patchwork constellations, etc. Basically, it's intersectional completely in its group of people, yeah? in those people who live there. And it's intersectional architecturally, because it works in the section. The entire house is one kitchen house. What is beautiful in this case is that all the corridors become very amazing living spaces. And what is the most intersectional part of that maybe is that in the cellar, there was this only other renter that wouldn't leave the place. And it's actually a fraternity, and fraternities in Austria are quite chauvinist, up to racist group of people. And I have to say that a collective can be so a collective of people, of minority people, yeah, can be so strong to say we live together, yeah, with such a kind of opposed or antagonistic group is amazing. Okay, so here I watched them for half an hour. They needed half an hour to actually organize their solidarity economy model, saying, okay, who can pay how much? Yeah, we had already organized the entire house for everybody. people in the wheelchair need more space, others need a smaller room, and so on. In half an hour, they organized to pay together, with everybody just paying how much she can. So the intersectional city house is accessible in many senses, not only physically, but economically and socially. And this is the classical architectural drawing of all the different spaces that are actually organized in this house. So this is, for instance, the kitchen. You can see that it's really low budget. It's not about designing the beautiful fixtures of the house, but what I did as an architect is help them, support them, design the structure to actually make this living together possible. And of course, it's beautiful because it relates back to Red Vienna in terms of a self-built settlers movement concept, and also the one kitchen house. And in a similar scheme, a second version of alternative housing is the so-called group Schloer. Schloer means living better without Raiffeisen. Raiffeisen is one of the biggest banks in Austria. So it's a clear kind of antagonistic move against or versus banking. And it's the same concept again, but it's not a one kitchen house, but its strength is that it's also working on taking out private houses off the free market economy. How do they do that? It's a group of very powerful young people who have been working on this project for 3 years. The project is located in the east of Vienna, much different to where we just were, a rather industrial zone, and they found an area that they can actually also buy. They buy it in order to actually collectivize. This is on Viennese Donaukanal, they're advertising. They just managed with crowdfunding to get all their money together. And this is the project that we are architecturally working on. So we are reusing a lot of the structure to actually have a circus center and community center. Then the people will live there and work there, and there's ateliers and co-working, and it's in an area that is absolutely rough, which actually makes its quality. So a lot of it is actually possible there. And the organization of that is that they are literally trying to do that without banks, without a loan. They just managed to have half of the 3.8 million already by crowdfunding organized, and this group is setting up an organization called Habitat, which is very similar to Mietshäuser-Syndikat in Germany. It's a collaborative association that is buying out of the market houses and land to actually collectivize it and take it out of speculation for good. So while they are doing this, we architecturally are doing that, so to say, to organize, build models, define the spaces. And I'm just showing you how that generally works. What the Mietshäuser-Syndikat, for those of you who are interested in Germany, is quite strong because it has already up to 140 houses together all over Germany. And it's supporting Habitat in Austria, where our project is the fourth. And the nice thing is, it also is based on solidarity economy, but in a larger scale, that it says, okay, these houses are built with debt or crowdfunding, and then it says secured rent control, self-rent controlled rents. And then once the debt is paid off, the rent stays the same, and there's a margin, which we would call a solidarity margin. And this budget goes into new projects, supports new projects to ever kind of, again, do housing that work without speculation. That's very similar to generally council housing, cooperative housing, or, and here I was just listing initiatives that are currently trying the same to actually see that we're keeping out or taking out houses that are there for people's need to housing of the free market. And my last project, if you stick with me, is one that is an urban planning project, and it's much more a top-down project than those that I just showed you in terms of self-initiatives. It was a competition that we won, a competition by the city of Vienna. Susan Graup and me worked together on this project, And after winning the competition, worked for 4 years, 3 to 4 years, with lots of meetings and so on, with the city of Vienna to organize this scheme. So it's all about the Donaukanal, I will show you in a moment, is the river central in Vienna. The right to the city is a right to the center. It's about inventing of urban planning tools. It's the questioning the role of the public, defending public space, and most of all, it's what I believe strongest in, a combination of institution and popular agency, politics and popular agency. How is that so? This is the Viennese Donaukanal, the Danube channel running right into the center of Vienna. Here you see how dense and tight it is. It's quite a large area. This is the area of our planning. We compared it to other parks in Vienna, also to make sure the quality of it. Its history is Otto Wagner regulating the Danube 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, and imagining a flaneuring zone. And today it's a great zone for, this is a party, for instance, more informal, hanging out by the waterfront, more informal green spaces, playgrounds, but here you already see, as everywhere in city centers, urban beaches. Urban beaches are growing, and it is quite commodified a lot. The urban space here you see Raiffeisen, I just mentioned it, the bank. And this actually is like a built diagram, one of these urban beaches alongside each other, where you can see how they get closer and closer to the water. They're expanding their space, having more and more, taking more and more space of the public space for the kind of for the gastronomy, for making profit with the place, while the space for the pedestrians and the people moving gets smaller. That, of course, is a real creating a real conflict. And there's another conflict which is based on austerity politics, basically saying this is the way private gastronomies are awaiting its public. And this is, and clearly it's not everywhere the same, but it's a very extreme example of a public bench situated inside of 3 waste collection ways. This is the waste collection of the restaurant on the left. This is the waste collection of the restaurant on the right. And this is the little waste bin that is logically the one next to the bench. So this is, of course, nearly a polemic confrontation of images, but it has been very powerful to say, okay, well, we need public spending in public space to actually make sure that people who cannot or do not want to afford to have a drink in a restaurant or in an urban beach actually also find a good quality seating. Yeah? I'm not saying that all of Vienna looks like this, surely not. Yeah? But in order, as a planner, to actually make show what has to be done, that was one powerful combination of images. So our project, don't worry, I will not get you through that, just to show that it was complex and rich and multi-layered. I'm going to show you 3 elements of it that were literally inventing tools within urban planning that weren't there for us. One was a non-building plan. We realized what we need to do first is secure public space to be not commodified anymore, to be not built on anymore, be it private or public, to make sure for a growing dense city to find enough place by the water for the 2 million people actually that would enjoy the waterfront. So what we did is, we did not study, because I think as architects, you know, of course, building plans, but we said, okay, we need the same powerful tool as building plans for a non-building plan. Yeah? And now, normally, I'm actually working a lot in mediation, and I'm doing lectures and workshops and so on to help people understand the language of drawing. And I actually would rather critique the building plan for its unreadability of non-architects. But in this case, we purposefully took the same quality of red lines, abbreviations, and so on, and drew ourselves a non-building plan throughout the entire area to say, okay, we preserve and we have a drawing that will now be able to be folded up in the city of Vienna to say all of that is meant to stay public, which is all the waterfront, yeah, none of it ever to be given to private investors. All the historic stairs, the beautiful thing is if you do that, you even recreate what has been there, yeah? Which of course if you just build anyway, it wouldn't happen. And then make sure there's enough space for the mobility of people along the waterside. So we did this for this entire area, also in terms of zoning, making sure that there's green areas. Only the orange would be one piece left for more gastronomy, for another urban beach. And it looks like this, and it's really very detailed, very careful, 1 to 500 drawing. And the second instrument, which was the one, when the one was kind of making sure that nothing would, like that, to keep the public space from being commodified. The second was to say, okay, we need an instrument that helps these multifold responsibilities on this area to actually increase the quality of public infrastructure. So we said this river actually is like a core, like a partitur, which of course in Vienna is nice because you have the Donau Walzer and you have the Danube music, so it's like it reads well, and this is also what we need to do. And we stretched it and we developed 4 long drawings like this, which actually help because they are not so specific, site-specific, to actually look at the rhythm of public infrastructure, to say, okay, what's the distance between, in what distance do we have another public toilet? Where could we find it? We don't at once kind of have to place it, but actually rather make it a goal that then we can actually really localize. So that has been a very useful tool. And the third tool was a manual, more usual. I won't get you into that because we're already quite late, but how to actually use space, how to deal with this beautiful cinematographic effect that Otto Wagner built into the city. This is the now subway, then city line, where you see the city, the water, like a movie. And to say, okay, well, graffiti is not your problem, but the problem is that you're building, that you're closing these windows. That's really the heritage to be solved, and not the quality, not the wall. And when we were writing up the non-building plan plus the manual, we of course also said, okay, all the waterfront and all the stairs are to be kept public, yeah, and never to be built on. And that was the moment when they said, yes, but with these stairs, and this is 100-meter long historic steps in the center, but unfortunately there we're already too late, that's what we heard, because there's an investor and he already has the rent for that, and he will build a restaurant on top of these steps because he wants to be by the water, and on steps you cannot have a restaurant. So when we heard that, we were like, what? It's like the only steps that you have publicly, and you would give that to a private investor to actually then build over it. So we said, well, we cannot accept that as planners. We went up to the vice mayor saying, listen, guys, what's happening here? And the nice thing was, we already had our non-building plan in our hands, which logically, with these steps, was only red, saying, nothing can be built there. That's so important to the public, and also the accessibility and so on. So we were powerful enough to actually secure that, and the deal was unmade and so on. And every time I pass by the steps, I feel like I built them myself. It's like because you saved them. It's a very beautiful spot in Vienna. So we handed in our handbooks, 3 books, 4 plans, all documents and so on, to the city of Vienna, but we weren't able to really get them collectively really to support it. So it disappeared in the shelf in a way. Up to this moment, when the last piece in the sun, flat, that's not a restaurant yet, actually was claimed by an investor to build an 800 people's restaurant on this spot. And this was the moment when actually popular agency, when a citizenship, a citizen protest group actually asked us, but didn't you make a plan that was clearly saying this is not to be built on? We said yes, but it's not published. So they actually supported us with other people to ask us to show them the plan. We sent it into the city of Vienna. By that, forced them to publish parts of it. And actually this group that literally also set themselves on the grass saying we will not have this happen, they managed to have our plan be published yeah, actually get out of the shelf, become a political tool, and they related their initiative to, here is the link to our Donaukanal partitur, and they used as an argument our plan to actually secure this Donaukanalwiese, as it's called, this spot from being commodified. So this protest actually activated, yeah, if we had something like a political potential in the plan, yeah, which kind of, if we speak with Derrida, would hope for, actually the political potential was hoping for popular empowerment or for popular agency. So it's actually, it would have been nothing, literally, yeah, without the initiative, without kind of the radical democratic movement that would say, okay, but also them would have been not so strong, wouldn't be there, this plan. So I guess that's really where I wanted to show you that I do believe that it's a combination of finding ourselves a position in institutions and reframing the public, but most of all kind of supporting and empowering popular agency. Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Gabu. I think that was like a really inspiring lecture, but one of my favorite parts was when you actually encouraged everybody to take a position and how you can't really separate yourself from the politics. And I think that's a really important, I guess, call to action to do. I guess to start, maybe a few questions from the audience before we go up to have some drinks. I wanted to ask you specifically about this idea of the commons, because I think throughout your talk you kept touching on these kind of utopian ideals, but that you actually showed could become a reality through collective action and popular agency. And through research I've been doing in Britain, actually, I kept noticing the similarities between London and Vienna throughout your talk. But in Britain, they recently published that only 4% of all land can still be classified as commons. And I was just curious as to, like, in Vienna, how do you define commons in terms of who owns them?
It's very interesting because we just had a 2-day workshop at Sheffield about commons. And why I wanted to show you the history of Vienna is because I do think that commons are locally very different. And I would say that, for instance, the 420,000 apartments in Vienna are a commons. Yeah? And if you say, okay, who is the biggest real estate owner in Europe, you could say it's the mayor of Vienna, or you could say it's the Viennese, or you could say it's the people who live in Vienna, actually to exactly make it not a kind of place nationalistic way of owning. So if you have public housing is a commons, yeah? It's a commons, and that's why I want it to be radically democratized in terms of what these 2 projects and many more we're working on now, for instance, a women's housing project. What they are doing, they're challenging the standardized social housing production that is also going on in Vienna to actually say there is needs of people, yeah, and engagement and self-initiative that also needs to find a place there. So what I'm really interested is in scaling that up to say, okay, how can that become a mode in the production of even mass housing? I even think that we need another term for mass housing, or like that we need to acknowledge that this is important and get rid of what it has such as a bad connotations. But coming back to commons, so coming from Vienna, where the situation is not as privatized as in other places, I realized that I would think I'm big in favor of defending public space, while I can see that in radically neoliberalized places, commons have the promise of regaining what has been privatized. Yeah? So where we still have a lot of public, commons rather actually have the tendency to say, to privatize public, yeah? Because, I mean, let's say the classical simple things of like, let's take urban gardening. It's a very trivial example, but for instance, on Donaukanal, there were some spots where there's urban gardening, and we had long discussions if that is actually still public space. Yeah? Because at the end, it's quite privatized. It's not everybody enters so easily and so on. So should be there also as a quality, but it should not be forever given to this group. That's the quality of publicness. But, and that's why I brought in the two democratic crises. Of course, the problem of public is that once you have, for instance, a right-wing government that doesn't believe in public at all, they may privatize it all. Yeah? If, for instance, Vienna, what is also so interesting with reading Vienna in the 1930s to today is, in the 1930s, it was an enclave, yeah? Then it was a red Vienna within a kind of conservative country turning more and more fascist. And now it's an enclave, red-green, yeah? Within, again, kind of a conservative, right-wing political country. Yeah? Very similar, and actually that is a similar situation to many cities. Yeah? Cities, that's why I mentioned only briefly, but I was also researching new municipalities, rebel cities, sanctuary cities, which are all similar in the way that they are kind of trying, similar to Red Vienna, even to see what can they do within their legal means and possibilities to defend more right-wing or nationalistic politics outside. So the commons are really interesting to me. How do we define? I think that I'm coming from the side where I say I want to defend public space as public, but radically democratize it in terms of it for being able to be used. Now, for instance, in the Donau Canal project, many people asked us, but you know, in the school you did such beautiful participation process. We do a lot of schools and kindergartens and so on. But for the Donau Canal Danube Channel, why didn't you do like participation processes, involve the public? And we said, like, well, I really don't know a process that could involve 2 million Viennese. Do you know one? And we said, okay, and this is where we turned from, we actually said equity planning would be the much stronger or much more valid way of working there, to say, okay, we do take responsibility as planners for the space to be actually secured from privatization and monopolization, to be there for 2 million Viennese, to find space, to do then whatever they want. But if I would take the time to ask 2 million Viennese, now I'm being a bit over-exaggerating, what they would like to do there, it would take so much time. At the end, there is not a piece of land left. Yeah? It's all privatized by then. So there's, I think, really moments where you have to choose which tools and which way of acting do you apply, and also from where do you start. And I think that's maybe really the difference between different notions of commons. We also discussed commons in, for instance, former communist cities or areas, completely different notion. Yeah? Then you with commons, like there's this afraidness of communism coming back. Yeah? So I would be very careful with using that at the moment, this fashionable term too general, but to really look at what's the hope that is implied in it. Yeah?
No, I actually asked that as a provocation because I think it's a term that's used quite a lot but needs more specificity. Mm-hmm. And I think actually what I really enjoyed about the lecture was how you were inventing these tools that actually embrace the agency of architects, but we have to know when to use which one. Like the non-building plan I thought was really terrific, and I think it's something that you should really like patent and push out there to get everyone to use.
I think with a lecture here it's patented, is it not?
I wanted to open it up to see if anybody had any questions for Gabu.
Thanks, Gabu, for a really, I think, carefully crafted lecture, and one that's kind of urgent. But I wanted to ask a really boring architectural question. Because your constituencies are largely non-architects, the people you're trying to communicate with, a little bit of planners perhaps in one corner, but largely a public which is diverse, you operate, I think, with a certain strategy of representation in the drawings, which to my eye recalled certain abstractions or clarifications that Otto Neurath would have been interested in his mapping, but have been taken further, particularly the long drawing of the canal and the way you begin to code that. How do you educate non-architects to read those? How are those received? Because they seem to be doing critical work, and if they're then replicated in the media to make these political arguments, they seem to have a job to do that's so dynamic that I wouldn't know quite how to convey the legibility of them. You must work very hard at that, or there must be an audience that you look to that are used to receiving those things that we might not appreciate because of that backstory of Red Vienna, because of that laboratory of the city being so unique.
Do I understand you right that you're saying it still is asking a lot of the audience?
How do you organize your audiences to receive that graphic information so that they can be empowered and use it?
Well, I think this is one of the biggest challenges of architects, the manifold audiences and the manifold actually abstractions of drawings. Yeah? I cannot have a hand sketch with exclamation marks, activist drawing on a construction site of a construction company, no? And the company, so, and then again, I cannot have a construction company drawing to actually activate popular agency to join me in a fight or battle for something. So in this sense, and I have to say, I'm even critical of representation for the sake of representation, but then again, how do I convince an audience like you? So it's really tricky, no? And in fact, I do think that architects have a lot of work and quite, let's say, that's definitely not paid in a sense properly to say, to have these multiple languages, because I don't really know how you could bring it all together in one drawing. And I don't think that's really possible. So in a way, it needs a bit of patience or acceptance of a crowd like you to say, okay, well, we're taking the drawing of Schloer, like what they all do as a not so architectural drawing. Yeah? But then again, I'm maybe sometimes, especially in these very low budget projects, yeah, the question is how can you actually spare yourself and the client and so on to do all this kind of extremely elaborate construction drawings. Yeah? And then a sketch on the construction site may do. Yeah? So it's again the question of choice of tools, maybe even inventing tools sometimes, and also finding out where do you need kind of certain expertise anyway, but also what's the level of energy that you put into where. Yeah? I'm very happy. I'm actually often in juries, also in Austria, of architectural competitions. We could also discuss competitions. It's of course a critical problem of architecture. I think competitions are insofar amazing as with architectural competitions, we architects constantly provide so many alternatives to a question. Yeah? Once competitions are stopped, and they're very easily stopped with communicative processes, suddenly you have no alternative. You have one consensual project. Yeah? And this is why the thing that we do need to critique, which is architectural competitions, however, still bring inequality of saying to every question there's always more than one alternative. Logically, we know that as architects, but with the kind of communicative planning strategies going on, this is being reduced to a classical TINA situation. Yeah? So I'm now already expanding your question, but when I come back to these competitions, we've now started to actually eliminate, up to prohibit, perspectives in competition entries. Not because I think perspectives are the most beautiful architectural tool, yeah? But you know what, architectural offices started to spend thousands of euros on super fancy, high-class perspectives, and then you're in competition juries, and you have the client, and the client walks to the super fancy perspective and wants this project. Yeah? So actually we say no perspective allowed. We even put white paper on top of it. And suddenly the abstraction of the plan and section and the need of the architect in the jury to translate that into images in the head of the client has become the tool to actually talk again about the quality of the plan. You know, so actually it's the opposite of what we would think, that we need drawings that are most clear to read, have become the biggest problem.
Thanks for
Hi.
the presentation, by the way. It's very... Oh, is it on? Okay, it's very cool.
Thank you.
I like the part
As
that...
cool as Zuländer.
Yes, I mean, it's very relevant to what's happening in the world. I mean, especially in Europe, like in general. I just wonder, like, for the previous answer, like the one before, you mentioned the term the commons, and I just wonder when you're using the word the commons in various presentation, either to the clients or to audience like us, are you specifically referring to something that's unique to the Vienna context, or do you have a definition for the commons when you're using the term? Like, how would you define the term? And like, how it's different from others, like public, for instance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the classical definition of commons would be air, water. I think we have to include land, yeah, because land is not reproducible. So this is where actually, and we had a lot of debates in Austria at this moment, because land prices have, like in every other city, skyrocketed. Yeah? And I wrote a paper to actually say we need land price to be limited, like rent controlled, yeah? Land control price. Or actually, I would think that land shouldn't be privatized at all. There's many, many good ways of saying you can use land but not own it. Yeah? And that means you can use it privately in many ways. I think it's called, what's the English word for that here? But in German it's called Baurecht, Erbpachtrecht. So that's all ways of like using land for 90 years or 100 years or so, but it's not being privatized in a sense, or like not ownership. And in this sense, we've just achieved quite a success in Vienna, because, like this is now politics again, there's a new zoning law that actually defines, or the politicians can now define areas that have been green land and turn into housing, to actually define it as social housing. And that means also that this price of the land has to be low, which effectively people call, those who own land, they call it quasi-expropriation, because the politicians are actually limiting their expected speculation money that they're already looking for. So in this sense, I would say that land generally is a commons, and when it comes to housing politics, if we think, and I think this is what we need to, and this is now not every architect's task, but it's one that I find my task also to say, if we can if we can show people that that housing is a human right rather than an investment strategy. Yeah? At the moment, housing is an investment. Yeah? It's totally different to saying if housing is a human right, it is public. Yeah? And once it's public, then you can logically, democratically, publicly, politically kind of intervene in the housing market. And it's not an intervention, it's not disturbing the private market, because housing is no market. Yeah? And this is why when you actually start to define it as something else. And I wonder if that's why I said we could see this social housing, large amount of apartments in Vienna as a commons. Yeah? Because it's something that collectively, yeah, but the only problem is that the way commons are conceptualized now is, of course, that a smaller group of people can actually define what will be done with it, yeah, with a certain commons. And that's, of course, when it comes really to mass housing, it's a different level. That's why it's representative democracy that is taking care of that, and radical democracy is pushing it and trying to see that there's better accessibility and so on. So I agree, maybe commons is not the right word, but it was in reaction to the question to say I would understand it in any case as a common good, yeah? And as a common task, because it's a public task, because housing is a human right.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. I'm afraid I have another question about language and why you chose to frame things in the way that you did, because I think it speaks to just that, why what the driver was. I'm a landscape architect, and I'm quite inspired and impressed by the canal master plan that you've done. And I'm just wondering, firstly, why you decided to call it a non-building project as opposed to frame it as a landscape master plan, let's say. And whether or not, when you frame it in that way, whether it sort of takes a different approach, like a non-development approach, you know, it doesn't have to be capitalistic, can still be radical, these sorts of things, but there's an idea of development and change at the river, let's say.
Thank you for this question. It's funny because non-building plan was, especially Nichtbebauungsplan in German, was debated. It was highly conflictual. Yeah? The city of Vienna didn't want it at all to be called like this. So officially it's called Rahmenplanung öffentlicher Raum, which means frame planning for the public space. Yeah? So it was much too negative for them. Yeah? And we said, well, in these times we need a clear language. Yeah? So the non-building plan was really it was more a reaction, and this is why of course the first question was good about the tools and how they mediate to which audience. Generally with my students I would critique building plans, yeah? For their unreadability, for their authority in the way kind of they are drafted up, which make it very difficult for people who actually have access to read what's happening in their neighborhood, or so to really read it. Yeah? So in this sense, I think we need some democratization of drawings, of official public drawings. And in this case, however, where we saw, okay, this is so much, public space is already so much in danger there, yeah? And it's kind of it's after 20 years of development on this Danube channel, yeah, of development, meaning the classical development. And you know what? Politicians know exactly how to make use of the starting point of a construction site, you know, with the kind of thing. You know how this image looks like, yeah? How does an image look like when you say we build nothing? How? Yeah? We need to actually even invent this image. How do you sell development that is not development in the classic sense? Yeah? How do we frame and argue for a future of the Danube Channel that is not built more and more urban beaches? That is difficult, yeah? And that's why I think at this moment the non-building plan is a good choice, because it really awakens the people. It's speaking to the more actually to the people in the city government, yeah, and in the city administration, to use it really as a kind of powerful tool, as much as the building plan. You know what it stands for. Yeah? It gives you rights and it denies you rights. Yeah? As an investor, as a private, not only of course, but this is where the antagonistic moment is. Yes, of course we could call it a landscape plan, but a landscape plan, again, at this moment, is a change and a making of something. Yeah? And to say, okay, actually we called the Danube Channel, informally, we called it the low line of Vienna, literally opposed to the high line in New York. Yeah? Because it's a quality, it's a low line, it's like kind of a channel, yeah? And it has been this, you could call it with Foucault, this heterotopic space. So it's like a lot of graffiti, things can happen there. Yeah, it's a free space, and to keep this free space, that was kind of also our goal. Yeah? To say cities that grow and densify and formalize and so on, they need such spaces. Yeah?
No, I appreciate that, and also, I mean, I should have mentioned as well. I mean, you intimated that with the guidelines as well, and talking about the rhythm and identifying certain sort of services or what have you that would punctuate. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I would like to thank you for giving this lecture, and I found it really inspiring. I was also very interested by the public space proposal next to the canal, and you said it was your proposal was published with support of the citizens sitting on the grass against doing it. But then I wonder what happened next? And after it's being published, did anyone take any actions? Or
So, in fact, part of it is published. Yeah? Part of it is still in enclosure. That's the right of the government to say, okay, we commission studies, plans, guidelines, and so on. What happened was the one successful thing was exactly this protest, yeah, that made it, that got it into the awareness of nearly all the Viennese, yeah, of people who are interested in such in public space and planning processes. So it has become a reference, yeah, as a kind of as the non-building plan. It also has become a reference, I would say, for the moment where the politicians realized, okay, and this gastronomy, the investment plan was pushed and supported by a politician of this district. Yeah? So what I'm saying is I have a critical relationship to the public which I support and which I feature, and at the other hand I can see how the public is just as neoliberal as it's not. I'm critiquing mostly kind of public planners, public administration, and the public and politicians for what's happening, and never actually private investors. Yeah, it's logical that if you want to invest in urban space, that you want to make profit and so on. Yeah, what we need in these times is like a clear and good position from city planning politics, city planners, architects, and the position goes down up to the point where, believe it or not, of course, I was often asked, because the people knew an architect and urban planner, there was like people asking me, you're making this plan, you know, I give you a direct commission if you manage to have me a site there and a little restaurant. Yeah? Logically, this is what's happening, yeah? And to actually make clear, and this is what I mean, like to take these positions and situations up to the architectural point. As an architect, as an interior planner, you have to choose what you do and what you don't. Yeah? Who you align with. And this is what I said with, like, you may not say, I'm in this case I'm so much for climate, saving the climate, yeah? And on the other hand, I'm building, and in the green and one family houses or so. Yeah? That's ridiculous in itself, yeah? And that's why I brought in Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky as a reminder of saying, like, you cannot split yourself, yeah? So happily to say, well, you know, since years on my website we say no to one family houses. So many young architects are like, how can you say that? It's our business. I said, like, come on, I cannot write against what one family houses do to the climate, to the land and so on, and on the other hand do it because it's our business. Yeah? It cannot be our business if we believe in that. And this is, maybe I now kind of followed the long line. I forgot your initial question, but I think that's where the non-building plan basically is situated. And this is what, your question was what happened with it. I think it can, this is the nice thing, when you do projects, and they may not, I tried to show that. I have many projects. I have one that I actually wrote a long text in a nice book, a Routledge book, about where I was invited to do a art in buildings project in a prison, and I was really struggling with myself if I should do that or not. Yeah? And it was still money to actually be placed there, and at the end I did actually do something. I built for them kind of a football field, but in such a tiny space where a football field didn't have space. Yeah? So I folded it up, yeah, and the football field goes up the wall, and so I could have shown it's very beautiful images. Yeah? But it's as a project, again, it changes a bit, it makes the situation a bit better, but absolutely not really. Yeah? So what it tries to do is to imply the criticism aesthetically, to say, even though people may not see it, it can be reactivated. Somebody can speak about it, somebody can take this non-building plan again out of the shelf and use it. Yeah? You can use it as an example. There was a successful defense, yeah? There was this urban field was defended, and this fight was won, and it can be an example for the next one. Yeah?
And I wonder, was there any expense when you come up project like this, and did you come across any challenges, and what do you think? Do you think architecture has a voice, a powerful voice in this kind of city planning?
I totally think so. I only think that we have this voice only then if also, and this is where other alliances come in, very simply, purely alliances between architects. To say we only have a voice if we would collectively be stronger in declaring this is what we do and this is what we not do. Yeah? There was one moment was really great in Vienna, which the city of Vienna, rich city with this history that I showed you, declared some years ago, because of austerity politics, Maastricht criteria, it cannot afford to build the next 10 huge school campuses by itself, but will have to do them in PPP, public-private partnership. This is actually where I got really obsessed with PPP, because I was like, schools, yeah? Yet again, such a clear public task, yeah? And a public good, or common good. Yeah? How can you actually get private companies into this making in Vienna? Made me furious. Yeah? But then, and this was really nice, there was this moment, first competition. The chamber called me, knowing I'm a critical architect, and said, we have to cooperate for this competition. Can you please be in the jury? And I said, like, fuck no, I will not be in your jury and be your helping hand to support this process. Yeah? A jury is well paid, you know, you could again say, and it's better it's me than somebody else. And of course, at the end, there was somebody else who did it. Yeah? But if everybody would have said no, but the thing continues, because at the end, what was nice is in the competition, half of the competition entries were actually protests, were posters saying, we will not build this PPP project. Beautiful. Some people had their kids photographed. It's like, I will not go into an investor school. And so very nice, yeah? Very creative. Yeah? 40 creative architecture posters making clear that they will not support this. Yeah? But 30 nice projects by architects who did it. Yeah? So, okay, we didn't really manage a strike, yeah? But I think this would have been the right thing to do. But at least it was a moment of disturbance, and the politicians know very well, whenever they are public and they speak about their PPP projects, that there's somebody in the room is like, why are you doing this, and so on. And it's small steps, yeah, minimal politics, but it's at least holding against the tendency.
I think that's a great moment to not end, but to pause, to maybe continue the conversation more informally upstairs. But I think that's a great point to end on, to make us think, how can we advocate for greater collectivity even as a profession. So thank you very much, Gabu, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.